What's up, everyone? Before we get things started today, I wanted to let you know that Into the Fray is back. That's right, IRONCLAD's flagship series that shows you behind the scenes of how we do what we do is here to stay. Check out a sneak peek here. We are done with the first scene, which was the cell block scene, and now we're going to do the scene where two guards transport James Reese.
When I look at any project, I always try to envision how it will be in its final state, but I also try to think about who I'm working with in the crew. The good news is the crew for this is all an IRONCLAD team, and we're so well oiled. This was one of those ones that we really just had fun as a group with.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Good morning, everybody. How many of you have heard of kleptocracy? If you're anything like me, you probably haven't. And I knew nothing about it until I had this conversation with my guest today, Debra LaPrevotte. Kleptocracy is a major problem in the developing world, with massive amounts of money intended for food, medical programs, education, and public resources being stolen by corrupt leaders. Bribes and corruption have led to billions of dollars vanishing from developing countries. And our guest today, Debra, knows a lot about this issue. She is a retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent on the International Corruption Unit at FBI headquarters. She helped to start the FBI's Kleptocracy program and seized more than $1 billion from foreign corrupt officials. She's also a forensic scientist and spent several years at the FBI's Evidence Response Team unit at the FBI lab. And prior to her FBI career, Debra worked for the Department of Defense. At the time this interview was recorded, Debra LaPrevotte was the senior investigator for the Sentry. The Sentry seeks to disrupt and ultimately dismantle the network of perpetrators, facilitators, and enablers who fund and profit from Africa's deadliest conflicts. Today, her work is also featured on the new podcast series, A Nation for Thieves. How did you end up at the International Corruption Unit?
It was interesting. When I arrived, the FBI tried to get me closer to my daughter, and so they moved me to Washington Field Office. And I was born in D.C., so my mom was Air Force civilian, and so I get to Washington Field Office, and I think I was assigned to an espionage squad for 2 days. And that supervisor said, "Oh, we're starting a terrorism special ops group. I need to give up an agent and I don't know you. Goodbye." I'm like, okay, don't unpack your box. Okay. So now I am on a terrorism SOG, Special Operations Squad. And excellent training, right? I go back down to Quantico. I was trained by a former British Special Forces SAS guy. And he was like, "Deb, it's a come-as-you-are rule. If you jump out of the car and you don't have it with you, you don't have it with you, right? Right. So when you get out of the car, you got to have your gun, you got to have ammo, you got to have communication." And I'm like, I work in Northwest DC. I'm not being stripped by the IRA for a tracking device. But I did learn how to be in my car and see an assailant walking towards me, to bring my hand in under my seatbelt, release my seatbelt, grab my weapon, draw up, eliminate any obvious threats, grab my MP5 and bail out the other side of the car using the engine block as a deterrent. And so, I received excellent training. And for the next 2 years, I worked mostly surveillance on people who had a nexus to terrorism. And after 2 years, I said, I would like to do something else. I sit in a car 8 hours a day surveilling people. You have the eye? I don't have the eye. I thought you had the eye. And there was an opening on a squad that did money laundering and asset recovery. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'll give that a try. And so I go over to that squad, and they send me to complex financial manipulation class and a couple other things on money laundering. And I started getting cases. My first cases were, you're the case agent and say you're a drug case. Well, you're busy doing undercover buys, surveilling the bad guy. Well, I will come in behind you and I find out, where does he drive? Where does he live? Where does he bank? And on the day you're going to arrest him, I'm seizing his Lincoln Navigator or his Cadillac Escalade and his bank account, and maybe putting the lien on, anything he derived from his drug traffic. And then in 2003, I get my first case. They're like, hey, Debbie, FBI San Francisco is prosecuting Pavel Lazarenko, the former prime minister of the Ukraine. They only put a $40 million judgment in their criminal indictment. Would you go after the other 300 million he allegedly took? And I laugh. I'm like, yeah, that's bigger than all my other cases put together. Okay, yeah. So for the next so many years, decades or more, that was my first kleptocracy or international corruption case. So it took me several years, flew to Ukraine, flew to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Antigua, every place he had moved money, followed the trail, and I ended up seizing $258 million of the 300 million that we alleged that he had taken. Go ahead.
Obviously, I would never want you to describe the exact mechanism of how you do that, but is it truly a matter, especially in a digital era, of backtracking and just following the ones and zeros and figuring out how they are connected? How does somebody, I feel like I would have a hard time hiding $100. How does somebody hide hundreds of millions of dollars?
It's interesting because what they do is, and I tell people this all the time, when you seize $1 billion from a country, you buy big stuff. You buy a yacht, you buy a mansion, you buy this. You seize 100,000, a couple 100,000, you fly under the radar. You buy stuff nobody's looking at. But when I left the FBI in 2015, I had 10 cases on my desk where I was looking at people who had stolen more than $1 billion, $1 to $5 billion. Right. Each. Yeah, each.
Holy cow.
So, first thing I do is I look, where do you live? And Lazarenko just happened to live in California. He had bought a mansion in San Francisco, and the FBI in San Francisco arrested him. And so I worked very closely with the criminal investigator that was going to prosecute Lazarenko for moving ITSP, interstate transportation of stolen property, money stolen from Ukraine brought into the United States, right? Money laundering and the other things. He was indicted originally on a 54, 59 count indictment, and was eventually found guilty. I think 20, the judge threw out some because it's a liberal California court, but he was found guilty, served 9 years in prison, and then he sought asylum, and he's still living in California because he said if we sent him back to Ukraine, he'd be murdered.
Yeah, almost because he stole from his own country. That's so weird.
And I'm not happy that we provided safe haven for him, but not above my pay grade, I guess. But yeah, I look at where do they live? What do they buy? I want to know, who's your mistress? Where does she live? Are you paying for her place? I find out where you vacation. If you stayed at the Ritz in Morocco, you paid with a credit card. Then I find out how you paid. Then I find out how did you pay for the credit card. That identifies a bank account. How is that bank account fed? Right. And so for me to seize that, I have to trace it back to criminal conduct. So it's not just enough that you're a bad guy and you have bad money. I have to show there's a direct nexus from the money you stole to the money I'm seizing. And that takes interviewing people, talking to the law enforcement in that country. That's why I'm traveling everywhere, to either get my hands on records or to interview witnesses that were extorted by him. And that was my first case. And then I had some smaller corruption cases when I got a call in 2006 to go after the $5 billion that was stolen by President Sani Abacha out of Nigeria. And he was president for only a couple of years, like 4 or 5 years. He died under unique circumstances. 3 Indian prostitutes were involved, but he died And he is alleged to have taken $5 billion out of the country while he was president. And so a lot of that money was found by the Swiss because it was in Swiss bank accounts. So I ended up locating 630 million that had not already been identified. And we're returning that now to, in 2020, we returned 311 million. Last year, another 20 million of that. And there's 150 million that's still being litigated.
So $5 billion.
Right.
So $5,000 million.
Yeah.
How many people have to be witting to allow that to happen? Or is this a guy who is the president of the country who is on his Bank of America account? I realize, of course, that it's probably not a Bank of America account, but it's an example that I can think off the top of my head. Just transferring money. I feel like they can't be the only person knowing that this has happened. Or are they? Are they just doing it in plain sight, just siphoning money off? Like, how do they actually do this?
Well, they always have an inner circle, right? So one of the ways that Bacha got, I think it was like 2.63 billion. It was called the security vote scheme. But what he would do is he would say, write a letter. I need $14 million to buy bulletproof vests for my police department. And he would give that to his head of security, who would go to the central bank. The central bank would literally give them a box with $14 million, several boxes with $14 million in it. And he would take it back. And in that way, they siphoned $2.63 billion out of the state coffers. And Mohammed Abacha, the son of President Abacha, was interviewed once. And they said, Mr. Abacha, when your father handed you boxes with $700 million in them, did you ask him, like, where did it come from? And he goes, it never crossed my mind. And so, that was that case. There's Malaysia, the 1MDB case, the Malaysia Benevolent Fund, $5 billion, $4.8 billion was stolen out of Malaysia. And it funded, part of that money funded The Wolf of Wall Street in California with Leonardo DiCaprio. He had no idea what the source of the money was. But
it funded the actual production of the movie itself?
Yeah. So the money, Mr. Razak, who was the prime minister, his nephew owned Red Granite Productions in California. And it's funny. Everybody says, oh, my God, it funded The Wolf of Wall Street. I said, well, it also funded Dumb and Dumber 2, but you don't hear about that one, right?
Yeah.
But, oh, yeah, they're still applying. I think thus far the FBI has recovered 1.8 billion of that money. And they're still tracking it now. Gaddafi, 50 billion while he was president of Libya. Yeah, Moldova lost $1 billion in 3 days, and they're missing several billion. I was just in Tunisia, and I think Tunisia's missing 11 billion. Lebanon is like 11 to 20 billion. So it's the amount of greed is absurd. But I will tell you, from the perspective of somebody who traces money, it's hard to move that money like bulk cash smuggling or without some type of paper trail. And so,
does the digital era make your job easier?
No,
Really?
Not really, because we still have, like, records from another country have to be requested through a mutual legal assistance request. So in some ways, but like, it's funny, people ask me, digital currencies are people using digital currencies to launder money? Well, yeah, people are. But look at kleptocrats, the corrupt leaders of the world. They're all over 50, right?
Yeah,
So
Bitcoin.
right, yeah. I was in Ukraine, and they're like, we hunt, we peck, we type with 2 fingers, and we like portable assets. We want gold, we want silver, we want diamonds, right? And so when President Yanukovych fled Ukraine in 2014, they said, Deb, we need boots on the ground. I'm like, you need my boots on the ground? Okay. Next thing I know, I'm in Kyiv, and I'm at the mansion, Medjugorje, and you just see the squandering of wealth, right? There's a Spanish galleon in the lake behind the house. From a forensic scientist standpoint, it was interesting because they had thrown all these documents in the lake behind the house. So there were dive teams in the lake pulling things out. I said, you guys, there's a sauna in the house. Let's put the documents in the sauna so that we can dry them out and read them. And we brought a forensic team in from the FBI lab, and they had a zoo, and I'm like, is anybody feeding the animals? I called PETA, and like everybody took off. Who was feeding the ostrich over here? And but he took $40 billion out of not him personally, but he drained the economy of $40 billion, which left the country wide open for Russia to invade in 2014 and to annex Crimea. I mean, I said I consider it the financial rape of a country. And, he's now living a life in Russia. But I show up in Kyiv and I'm like, hi, I'm Debbie LaPrevotte. I'm with the FBI. And they're like, we're being invaded. Could you come back? I'm like, yes, I'm aware. That's why I'm here. I'm here to help. And, we spent the next several years trying to trace money that had been stolen under Yanukovych. And then President Poroshenko came into Ukraine, and another $5 billion left under him because he was another ally of Putin. And Zelensky is there now. And recently I've become very popular because I seize assets, right? And everybody wants their money back. And so when the U.S. started seizing the yachts of the Russian oligarchs, everybody's calling me. They're like, Debbie, can we do with these yachts? And I'm like, well, first of all, there's got to be a premise. Like, why are we seizing the yachts? We're seizing the yachts because the individuals whose yachts we seized are violating sanctions. There's a asset seizure component of that. But I said, you want to get money back to Ukraine? $40 billion left under Yanukovych, $5 billion left under Poroshenko. Find some of that, and it's Ukraine's money. You can give it back. All of the state-owned enterprises in Ukraine that got taken over by Russia, all the money they've generated from that could easily constitute theft of government assets. Find where they're banking. When they take money out of the Black Sea, where does that money go? Find it, seize it, and give it back to Ukraine to rebuild. So there's almost always a paper trail. And that's when myself and others who work this kind of work, there's something to follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's episode of Change Agents is brought to you by Ketone IQ. You may be asking yourself, what is Ketone IQ? Well, the answer is that it's brain fuel. It is a clean energy boost without the sugar or caffeine. When should you use it? Well, the answer to that is kind of anytime that you want to re-energize. I use it in the morning before I sit down to have a podcast episode. And what I'll tell you is it provides me the energy and clarity that caffeine does, a coffee per se, but it lasts a lot longer. And I don't feel, it's not that I feel a crash with caffeine, but I don't feel the let off like I do with caffeine. It lasts a lot longer. It's a very sustained energy state. It gives me very good clarity of focus. And a lot of things that come with that, better memory, better word recall, all the things that I'm trying to do when I'm hosting a podcast episode. Cool thing about Ketone IQ is you can find it a couple places. One, if you live in a place that has a grocery chain called Sprouts, you can find that nationwide. Or you can find Ketone IQ at hvmn.com. I'm going to say that one more time. Hotel Victor Mike November.com. If you visit hvmn.com and you use the promo code Andy at checkout, you're going to save 20%. Again, that is hvmn.com. Promo code Andy to get yourself a clean energy boost without sugar or caffeine.
So you used a term that I hadn't heard until very recently, and it's kleptocracy. And I'm hoping that you can unpack that a little bit because I don't think it's a very widely used term or understood.
Absolutely. I laugh because I worked kleptocracy before it was called kleptocracy, right? It was just corruption.
Just corruption? Okay.
Yeah, international corruption maybe. But if you break it down, klepto, it's like to seize with compulsion. And I go, yes, they just can't help themselves. But a kleptocrat is a leader who puts their own self-enrichment over the wellness of their populace. And so, it's the Putins of the world. It is Obiang out of Equatorial Guinea. It was Abacha out of Nigeria. I mean, and the list just goes on. Assad in Syria. So, I mean, yeah.
As you're saying that, I mean, I try not to follow politics too much, but that term could almost be applied to members of our own government and their actions in office, as opposed to serving those that put them into office. I don't want to deep dive down a rabbit hole, but yeah, it'd be interesting if that lens was swung towards some of the behavior of our own politicians in our own country, probably at a smaller scale, but the intent to go in that direction of self-serving versus those that they are supposed to serve. Be curious to see how that would net out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a conservative, so I always look at two things. One, I love term limits. I would love term limits.
Could not agree with you more.
Yeah, I had to retire at age 52. 57 is the mandatory retirement age for FBI agents. And I'm like, how many people are over 80 in Congress and the Senate, right? It's like, or career. Or what's worse is that you serve 2 years, 2 terms, 8 years, and you get an income for life. If they would take it back to its original meaning of government service, where no, you come in, you serve for 4 or 8 years, and then you go have a wonderful career someplace else, but you don't start making $175,000 a year for the rest of your life just because you worked for 8 years as a congressman or a senator. There's a lot of things we could do, but unfortunately, the people who vote on that are the people who profit from that, and therefore we're at a juxtaposition on that one.
We certainly are. Yeah, it's. Let's go focus back globally. How big of a problem is kleptocracy globally? Because I tell you what, we're not going to solve any of the problems right now in our own country, because I agree, we're kind of at a standoff. The people who are going to make the changes are the ones that have worked their way into power, so it becomes problematic. But globally, going back to these individuals, how big of an issue?
Trillions of dollars globally illicitly moved. And it affects us in every country that provides aid, right? I work for the century now. Like, I do have the best retirement job. So, I had to retire from the FBI soon. I was 55 when I retired from the Bureau, and I would have had to retire in 2 more years. So I had the opportunity to work for George Clooney and John Pendergast, and they allowed me to just keep being an investigator, right? So, which is what I wanted to do. And so I work primarily South Sudan. But if you look at South Sudan, it was deemed the most corrupt country in the world for the last 2 years by Transparency International's Perceived Corruption Index. They got bumped, I think, by Syria this year. But if you look at the countries down at the bottom of the top 10 most corrupt countries, it's Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, Afghanistan. They're all places that are in turmoil because all of the money, it goes into the pockets of those people that run the country. Then they fund the military because that keeps them in power. But what suffers, education, healthcare, and just the civilian populations. There's constant civil war in South Sudan. 400,000 people have died in the last decade in South Sudan because of civil war. I did an investigation on profiting from rape, the financial motivations behind the 5-fold increase in rape and gang rape by the army in South Sudan. And, everybody knows that rape is a tool of war. It happens everywhere. But I thought, there's been a 5-fold increase. What's behind that? And so I started looking, and I found like 5 revenue streams. So one of them is rape as reward. The UN panel of experts in 2016 said the army in South Sudan is allowed to rape women in lieu of pay. So in other words, we haven't paid you in 6 months, so do what you want, take what you can, was what the general orders were. And so they could rape with impunity. And rape camps were set up where women were abducted and held for months with men 10 in queue at night as, again, reward for fighting. Women abducted and gifted as soldier brides. But also one of the things I did is I did an overlay. I did GPS coordinates for all the allegations, thousands of allegations of rape by the army, and I overlaid that on a map of resources. And sure enough, I mean, the Army is guarding the oil fields because they're 90% of the revenue generated for South Sudan. So there's a lot of rape associated with the soldiers that are guarding the oil fields, but also gold mining and teak. And there's a direct correlation between the natural resources being protected because they're funding the government, and where women are being attacked. But also we look at gold smuggling, and we look at state capture. So if you're the president of South Sudan, I mapped out 5 individuals: the president, his brother-in-law, the 2 former chiefs of staff, and another high-ranking general. And those 5 men had family members on 175 companies. And they were in mining, trade, media, banking. And so, I mean, it's state capture where the political elites and their family members have a very big footprint in the lucrative industries. The Century's reported on this, but President Kiir's 20-year-old daughter, Winnie, was a shareholder with 3 Chinese nationals on a mining company that was getting mining contracts. And I thought, well, what does Winnie bring to the table? Well, her dad's the president. That's what she brings to the table. She has no background in mining. And so we investigate things like that, where I map out the family structure of individuals, find out how they're profiting. And I mean, it's a never-ending process. But what you look at is the civilian population. I mean, for all of the U.S. soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, Karzai, very corrupt. And, his brother was a heroin trafficker. I mean, I knew from talking to the DEA guys. And, but I mean, look at the problems in Syria, look at the problems in Yemen, look at the problems in Eritrea, look at where there's tremendous wealth that has been diverted into the pockets of the political elite. Civilians are starving. They face food insecurity. 85% of women and 75% of men in South Sudan are illiterate because no money gets funneled into education.
Well, it sounds like there's the figurehead, who I'd be fascinated to understand at a deeper level how they came to power in the first place. And then they're strong-holding all the industries, like you said, with family members spread across 175 behind the scenes. Yeah, they're literally strangling the arteries of that country and directing it towards themselves. I mean, how could they have anything but that level of poverty and lack of education?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And one of the kleptocrats who has been in the media for the last few years is the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. It's a very small country on the west coast of Africa. It's tremendously oil rich. And I have to give it to the French. They prosecuted him in absentia and found him guilty of money laundering. And they seized like a $30 million mansion, a Lamborghini, and his fleet of cars. It's just the amount of money means they buy big things. And when they buy big things like a yacht, an aircraft, there's something to seize and try to get that money back. I'm testifying twice this year in my old FBI cases. There was a $58 million aircraft that was bought years ago with the proceeds of a shady oil deal out of Nigeria. And I traced the money to the aircraft before I retired from the Bureau. And I used to get a phone call every time it took off and landed. Agent LaPrevotte, the aircraft has just landed in Gibraltar. I'm like, 2 a.m. Thank you. I wrote it down. I was waiting for it to land someplace that would honor a U.S. seizure warrant. And after I retired in 2020, it landed in Canada. And Canada seized it for the government of Nigeria. And so I will be testifying to my tracing of the money to that aircraft and my knowledge of how it came to be. And then I'm testifying for the government of Bangladesh in December. It was interesting. I testified in Bangladesh in 2011, and I believe I'm the only law enforcement officer who's ever testified in a Bangladesh court. But that was a unique experience, right? I mean,
so where did the Century organization come from? Talk to me about the inception of this organization and what their mission statement is.
Well, We're a group of investigators and policy people, because we hit it from several avenues, who investigate greed that is causing conflict, right? Greed that's fueling war crimes, atrocities, and conflict. So, like, we don't look at Nigeria because, they're not putting their army against their civilian population. So we work Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Libya, Azerbaijan, Myanmar, and who am I leaving out? That'll come to me. And Libya, Azerbaijan, Myanmar, and one other. And so it started about 17 years ago when this genocide was happening in Darfur. The cast of Ocean's 11, so it was Matt Damon, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, Don Cheadle. They got together and they started Not on Our Watch and the Enough Project. We've had enough, trying to put an end to genocide. And for 10 years, they worked really to try to affect U.S. policy, to affect change in Africa. And after about a decade, they said, we're not having the success we want to have. I mean, like in changing things. And a friend of ours that worked at the White House said, you have to follow the money. And so the Century was born from that. Like, okay, we really need an investigative arm. And so they hired myself and some other people from DOD, former Treasury people, so that we would know, because we speak the right language, right? We know who to talk to. We know how to get things done. And we have wonderful investigators now from all over the world. And we started looking at at 4 countries to start: Sudan, South Sudan, Congo, and CAR. And, we exposed the political corruption. We exposed the corruption and the looting of state coffers while we try to affect policy decisions, not only in the US, but the EU, the AU, Australia, Canada, and say, look, there are things that you can do to prohibit travel for these individuals. Maybe their kids are going to college in New Jersey. Well, is the money that's paying for the college education criminally derived? Well, we don't want that. And so we put out reports that expose high-level political corruption and their dirty deals. And then we also push for policy decisions that could impact and have a really positive impact on Africa and other places that we're working now.
So you still have to rely upon state governments to some degree. You can provide them, you can basically do the legwork and provide for them the information, but it's actually on that state level government to action the information or do anything with it?
Absolutely. And the reality is, like, law enforcement can't be everywhere, right? I mean, the FBI has 14,000 agents at any one time active. And we have agents just dispersed all over the world in embassies, but they're not necessarily on the ground investigating. And so the world of NGOs like the Century and many others, and civil society, investigative journalists, the OCCRP, the Organized Crime Corruption Reporting Project, investigative journalists around the world, we pull all of that information together and we make it very public. And then the Century asks, in every one of our reports, we have policy like, okay, Treasury, this is what you could do. Okay, OFAC, this is who could be sanctioned, and here's the information to sanction them. We were very successful a few years ago. We found out that one of our South Sudanese generals had bought a $1.5 million home in Australia. And so I flew down to Australia. I conducted an investigation. I met with the diaspora community, the South Sudanese living in Melbourne. And next thing I know, somebody goes, oh, you want to meet up? I had tea with the general in his living room. And they think they're not doing anything wrong. But we pulled together all the information, like how the house was bought. It was bought in the name of his 24-year-old son who had a business that did no business. We collected that data and we handed it over to the Australian Federal Police. And unbeknownst to us, because they're not allowed to share, they opened an investigation. And a year later, I got a phone call and said, hey, Deb, just want to let you know, we seized Hak Mai's house and his daughter's $35,000 Audi. And they were able to get bank records and the things that I wasn't able to get my hands on. And but his wife went on TV and said, he fought in the bush for 20 years. He deserves this. And I'm like, well, How about all the people starving right now in South Sudan who fought in the bush too, right?
Where's my $1.5 million home?
Yeah. From an investigator standpoint, though, the good news was because it was a $1.5 million home, I found the website that had the virtual tour of the house. So before I'd ever gone in, I had already been in every room in the house virtually. It's amazing what's available online. That's how I was able to show that it was purchased in his son's name. His son had a business, an import-export business. I checked trade data. He hasn't imported or exported anything, and the address for the business was the house. So I was able to collect and do some of the legwork and hand that over to somebody who could do something with it.
Are there some governments that are more willing to take action than others?
Absolutely. I mean, the United States has been like a wonderful partner to our foreign countries, right? And we're in a very unique position. Most of the money that leaves corrupt countries leaves in US dollars. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons China and Russia are trying so hard now to get around that and literally hoard US dollars so that they can clear transactions without hitting the US financial correspondent banking situation, which gives them a venue to go after those assets. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. has, recovered billions of dollars from Malaysia, Nigeria, all these other countries. But in euro, like if the money moved in euros, I have no venue. So then you have to. But France did a wonderful job on the Obiang case. Germany, Canada, there's some. The UK has seized assets. The UK just enabled a unexplained wealth orders. And so if you're somebody living in their country and you have millions of, 100 million unexplained wealth, they could possibly seize it unless you can show that, no, it's not unexplained. Here, let me explain it to you. But, it's hard to show that on a general salary of maybe $60,000 a year in another country, you amassed a $100 million fortune.
Yeah. Could you help me to explain? So the kleptocracy, it seems like obviously it's benefiting the people who are at the top who can throw the levers. Can you help me draw the breadcrumb trail into how that actually is destabilizing the country and the violence and problems that can come from that inside of those countries as well? Because I have a feeling people listen, it's like, well, okay, yeah, there's some people at the top who are becoming exceptionally wealthy. I want to make sure that people also understand what that means for the citizens of those countries and what that level of corruption does to their daily life as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ukraine is a perfect example of that. Remember I said that Yanukovych took up to $40 billion out of the economy, Poroshenko another $5 billion. So when I arrived in 2014, the soldiers had limited bullets for their guns, and they're lining up on the eastern border and being invaded by Russia. So, I mean, under Yanukovych, he severely weakened the military purposefully so that Putin could annex Crimea and invade. And then you had 5 more years of that under Poroshenko. And so you've got Zelensky now who's doing a good job, and he didn't flee. He's stuck in place and is fighting for his country, but he's got a severely weakened military. South Sudan, which is where I work, is another example. 90% of their money comes from oil revenue, but they keep borrowing money and it's stolen. So they have already pre-sold the oil that's coming out of the ground until at least 2027. I mean, so no money is going to what money does go to is to the military and the security service that supposedly has 10,000 strong soldiers for a security service. I mean, their CIA, their Secret Service. But basically, it's a private police force for the president, and they've been accused of war crimes and atrocities. And that's why South Sudan was deemed the most corrupt country in the world. You have 4 million people out of 11 million that are displaced in other countries, like in Uganda and Congo and in border countries. You have 2 million displaced within the country. People that can't go home, and nothing's being made, right? Because you can't tend your fields. Your cattle get raided, and cattle is wealth there. Your cattle gets raided, gets stolen. But if you're wealthy you will go in with armed cattle herders and displace the people that live there so that your cattle can now graze on their lands. And so, I mean, it just disrupts the entire community. But South Sudan has been in turmoil since at least when they fought for independence in 2011. And that's an example. But when there is no free media, when there is no rule of law, when there are no prosecutions for corruption, when your phone is being tapped by the police, when you can be detained without ever being charged. I used to feel comfortable when I traveled to Nairobi. And then in 2017, two anti-corruption activists got picked up off the streets of Nairobi, and within hours were secreted onto an aircraft and taken to the Blue House in Juba, which is where their security service there tortures and interrogates people. And then they were murdered and thrown in the Nile. And for the next year and a half, no one knew they were dead. You know, Amnesty International, other groups were fighting for their release. They were dead. They were thrown in the Nile. Their families didn't know if they were dead or alive. And so, like, now, do I feel comfortable in Nairobi? No. You know, and so so much of the problems around the world can all be linked back to corruption.
Well, it seems like too, if you're living in that environment that you're describing, you're spending 0% of your time, energy, and effort looking upwards at corruption because you're just trying to survive or leave the country. So that connects the dots for me on how these people are able to steal so much money.
Oh.
I mean, what a better way to steal in plain sight than distracting your people with just literally trying to survive or flee the country that they're in.
Again, not getting political, but look who's coming across our southern border. And you know, you look at the triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize. I mean, the corruption is so great that people feel they have no opportunity. Mubarak, when in Egypt, I mean, Arab Spring happened because young men in that country had no opportunity. And
so we just, $100 billion to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving off the table the discussion people have, should we do that? Should we reinvest it back in our own country? How do we make sure that a portion of that $100 billion, it doesn't go down the same path that previous leaders in Ukraine or, anywhere in the world? When the U.S., I don't think a lot of people realize that the U.S. provides more aid globally than any other country on the face of the earth. How do we make sure that it's not absconded with by these people, these dictators that are in power?
Well, it's interesting because I will tell you, when the U.S. returns money that the FBI has seized or DOJ has seized, we say, look, we want to return your money, but we can't continue to help you if it disappears again. I mean, then it's not worth the effort of the United States to continue to help our foreign partners if we return hundreds of millions of dollars only to have it disappear again. So I know with Nigeria, the U.S. State Department sat down with President Buhari and his Ministry of Justice and said, tell us what you want. Like, what do you want this money to do in your country? And he goes, I want 3 infrastructure projects. So an agreement was made where the money that we were returning went specifically to 3 projects, that civil society and NGOs had to have full transparency to know how every dollar was spent, that the companies that would be subcontractors were vetted so that it wasn't, the president's nephew that had this company. And so steps can be taken. And frequently, like, I've always recommended to the State Department that they have a menu. Like, really, it's like, oh, is child infant mortality your problem? Okay, well, Doctors Without Borders will work in your country. We will give the money directly to Doctors Without Borders. It can only be spent in your country, and it's got to address your 3, whether it's Ebola, whether it's infant mortality, whether it's COVID. But we know we've given it for the benefit of your people to an organization that you say is a priority in your country. And so there are ways to safeguard. A lot of the aid that we're giving will be given in the form of food, so it's not like a check. But yeah, I mean, I've seen aid all over the country, all over the world, where the rice comes in these giant bags, and the first truck that pulls up belongs to a general, and he's loading, the aid rice into the back to feed his group first. And And I've talked to aid groups that say, yeah, we know 60% of it's going to walk, but 40% gets through. And I'm like, and you're happy with that ratio? And, but, they're not armed. Feed the Children isn't armed. UNICEF isn't armed. So, that's an unhappy truth.
Yeah. How do we get people in the U.S. to pay attention to this? Because, again, knowing that we were going to talk, I started looking into this. I had not heard the term kleptocracy until very recently. The amount of aid that the U.S. provides globally alone, the examples that you've given in Africa, in Ukraine, kind of globally, honestly. How do we get people in the U.S. interested in this, and then what can they do with that interest?
Well, people have asked me. A journalist once said, "How do I make somebody in Ohio care?" And
it's a tough one because we're talking about Ohio.
Yeah, right. And it's not that they don't care. They recognize that there is absolutely nothing as an individual they can do to stop the rape of a woman in Congo. I mean, women in Congo used to be raped every 11 minutes, every 11 minutes a few years ago. And so it's like this, it's like saying the pond here is poisoned. I'm horrified by that. But I personally, other than keeping you from drinking out of it, I don't know what I can do about it. And that's one of the problems. But I've had people ask me about the aid we're giving to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I said, what you need to realize is what happens if Ukraine falls to Russia. I said, there are other countries along the Black Sea that can be invaded by sea from Russia if Ukraine is now a Russia territory and part of Russia. And they said, well, no, there's NATO. I said, yeah, but there's a couple countries there that aren't NATO. And they certainly couldn't stand up to a Russian invasion. And so we have to look global. There are times where we have to think globally. And I would just say it's short-sighted. There are some things where, maybe, I'm never going to go to some of these places and I don't know how, but they affect world trade. Maybe grain. Maybe grain from our farmers is feeding people in that country. So we need to know that. And maybe the fact that we're taking food from those areas that's coming into our country is an issue. But I think aid is one of the big things that people have to recognize. When we provide aid, which we have to do often, our aid relieves them of their responsibility. I mean, it relieves the kleptocrat. Like, if you're going to feed the women and children in my country, I don't have to. But if we don't, they will starve. So, I mean, there's the dilemma. But I would say that at some level, you have to act locally, but you've got to care globally, because we are sending aid there. American tax dollars are going there. American servicemen are going to these parts of the world. And maybe it's a UN peacekeeping mission. Maybe it's Americans who happen to work for Feed the Children, for adoption centers. There's so much more global action going on, and people may not recognize it. The investment of the banks, where's the money? UBS in New York is part of UBS Switzerland, right? I mean, so HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, based out of Hong Kong, but one of the financial centers of the world. So it is still a difficult question to answer, but it's naive to not recognize that corruption all over the world is impacting us. I can tell you, I arrested a vice president of Riggs Bank years ago. And Riggs Bank, one of the biggest and most important banks in Washington, D.C. back in the day, doesn't exist now. Why? Because it was laundering money for all the embassies in Washington, D.C. And so, corruption around the world closed down a Washington, D.C. bank. And some of the banks that are failing now, have a large footprint in corrupt areas.
It's really easy to get stuck in the headspace of thinking only locally and not globally. And the reality is, we live in a global society. I'm sitting in my podcast studio right now, and I I could probably point out items that are from 5 different continents. I don't think about that from a day-to-day level, but I'm thinking about it now based off the conversation that we're having, the act locally and think globally. If people do want to act locally and they want to find more out about the Sentry, what you guys are doing, talk to me about where they can find more information, and if they want to support, how can they support?
Well, yes. I mean, we're an NGO, so we live off of donations. So yes, the Sentry would very much welcome donations. Go to thesentry.org, the SENTRY, thesentry.org. You can Google like the Sentry and Clooney. It'll pop right up. And you can see our reports, the kind of investigations that we do. And, what I would ask people to do is don't breeze by the international news, because the billions of dollars we're sending to Ukraine right now, well, that affects everybody. That's everybody's tax money going there. But I hope people understand the negative consequences if we don't help Ukraine. But I remember when all of our American soldiers were in Afghanistan, and how corrupt the Afghan government has been. And I worked with SIGIR, the Special OIG for Iraqi reconstruction and for Afghan reconstruction. And the amount of corruption, again, puts our soldiers at risk. And so on so many fronts, the fight against corruption still comes home. The money moves through our U.S. financial systems. Look at how many things in the United States are owned by Russian oligarchs or Ukrainian. Our mining operations out of West Virginia, some of them owned by Russian and Ukrainians. China owns, I can't tell you how many poultry producers. And Smithfield ham is now, I believe, owned by China. So
a lot of farming ground as well.
Yes, there is a big hunk of farmland that is being bought by foreign nations. And that's really disturbing. When I buy Smithfield and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm supporting China. So I could tell you that 80% of the people I talk to would have no idea who owns the farmlands, owns some of the mining operations, the real estate market in the United States. When you're asking how does this impact us? When I left the FBI in 2015, there had been a 70% increase in the sale of luxury homes in California to Chinese nationals.
Really?
Yeah. Look at Venezuela and the Miami real estate market, right? The head of PDVSA, Rafael Ramirez, used to fly into Miami, and he had diplomatic immunity. So who knows what he flew in with? But I know that properties are being seized in Miami that are the proceeds of Venezuelan corruption. The FBI took down a baby ring. I think there's like 700 Chinese nationals in the last decade that have come in and had their offspring in the United States, making their children U.S. citizens, naturalized U.S. citizens, which allows them to bring mom and dad to the U.S. when they get older. And it's like baby tourism. The women come in at 6 months pregnant. They stay for 3 months in luxury accommodations and bear their children here. The FBI has taken a couple of those down, but that's just one example. And then I think the big example right now is the millions of people that have crossed our border in the last 3 years. I mean, it's staggering. I ask everybody every day, I'm like, were there 3 million beds in the United States that weren't slept in last year? Like, where are they going? And if they're here illegally, they don't have social security numbers. Are they contributing to the tax base? Because they're certainly benefiting from the tax base. I live in Northern Virginia. I'm in line to vote, and I look at the elementary school poster on the wall, and it says 27 languages are spoken in this elementary school. So what kind of challenge is that for the teachers that teach in these areas? And these are kids we assume are here legally. So, if you want to know how it's impacting you, my sister lives in Texas. She's like, you can't believe what it's like down here. And nobody seems to care. And so I have a real problem with like 125 people in the terrorism watch list coming across our southern border. I have a real problem with not knowing who. If 3 million people invaded all at once, we'd consider ourselves being invaded. And because it's a few thousand a day or, 20,000, it doesn't say that. To me, that's an invasion of our country where we don't know who you are, why you're here. Some are asylum seekers. Not all of them are. Some of the countries they're coming from, it's not just south of our border. And so the amount of money that is going to have to house, feed, educate, and keep healthy people, that's every American taxpayer. So there's a reason, and a great deal of that is related to corruption south of the border in every one of the countries that those people are fleeing.
Yeah, it truly does bring the global issue back home. I recently had a Border Patrol agent on my personal podcast, and we recorded somebody who'd spent a lot of time as a Border Patrol agent for change agents. And the term that they used was OTM, other than Mexican, crossing the border. And the vast majority of people are actually not Mexican.
Yeah.
They're from the countries that you have mentioned, and they choose the southern border because the immigration laws in Canada are stiffer, and it's easier to work their way up through our southern border. But it's a perfect example of how it's a global issue and how that global issue can impact you locally if you choose to bury your head in the sand and at least, or if you choose not to make educated decisions or to educate yourself about what's going on from a global perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I took an oath 27 years ago to protect the United States against all threats, both foreign and domestic. And all of my Border Patrol friends took the same oath. And right now, we're not being given the tools to protect the United States against threats, both foreign and domestic.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. Debbie, thank you so much for your time. I'll let you close it out with whatever you would like to.
Just everybody be aware and understand that corruption is a never-ending, whether it's here in the United States or abroad. It's something that has to be brought to light. The best thing anybody can do is, if I hate to say see something, say something, but do that. Contact the Sentry, contact the FBI, contact local law enforcement if you see something that's suspicious. But everybody, what do they say? Evil thrives when good men do nothing. So do something.
Perfect ending. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Have a great night.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more about the work that the Sentry does, please visit their website at thesentry.org. Normal spelling on all of that. Debra also recommends checking out anti-corruption NGOs and civil society organizations, including Global Witness, Transparency International, Global Finance Integrity, and Center for Advanced Defense Studies.